When we look at the transport of oxygen in the blood, you probably know that it involves the red blood cells or the erythrocytes. So that's the name for red blood cells. Our blood is very much full of red blood cells, and it actually makes up generally about 45 to 50% of our blood. And these erythrocytes are very weird cells because one of the things that they are characterized by is a lack of a nucleus. So they lack a nuclei. They're produced by the red bone marrow. And they generally have a short lifespan. So they live about 120 days. They also have a very characteristic shape. So they are like a biconcave disc. So if I were to draw like a side view, it would look like this. So this is my biconcave disc. And the shape is really important because it allows them to travel through very small blood vessels, which are called capillaries. And this is where gas exchange takes place with the air in the lungs, as well as with the interstitial fluid in the tissues. So what the erythrocytes have, which causes them to be red, is hemoglobin. So they contain huge quantities of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is our respiratory pigment. And one of the interesting things about hemoglobin is it binds reversibly to oxygen. So what that means is it picks it up under certain circumstances and then it releases it under other circumstances. So it must behave in a very kind of a complex way in order to respond to differences in the environment. So let's look at a diagram that shows the hemoglobin molecule. This is actually from the chapter in your book on blood. The hemoglobin molecule consists of 4 globular proteins and then the heme group, which contains iron. So the hemoglobin molecule has 4 heme groups. So that means that it could bind, each hemoglobin molecule can bind to a total of 4 oxygen molecules. So we can say each hemoglobin molecule can bind to up to 4 oxygen molecules, and it binds to that iron. So this is why we need iron in our diet in order to produce hemoglobin. If we don't have iron in our diet, that could lead to a form of anemia, which could mean that our blood has poor oxygen carrying capacity. Okay, so when we look at this hemoglobin molecule, we can talk about it reversibly binding. And so there's a chemical formula that can be written. This is deoxyhemoglobin, and it can be combined with oxygen, and it binds reversibly to form oxyhemoglobin. Okay, so there's my chemical formula. And that double arrow just means that it goes in backwards depending upon the environment. So this is hemoglobin binding reversibly to oxygen. Okay, so this is deoxyhemoglobin. And this is oxyhemoglobin. Okay. When it binds, it changes slightly different color, right? So oxygenated blood tends to be bright red. Unoxygenated blood or oxygen or blood with low oxygen levels tends to be a dark red. So it is really not blue. It just, the blood in our veins looks blue because of the way it's reflected through our skin, the color. Okay, so when we look at this, we can talk about what is referred to as hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve. And this has two variables. It has hemoglobin saturation, which saturation refers to how much oxygen is bound to the hemoglobin molecule. So if it's 100% saturated, that means each of the hemoglobin molecules have 4, right? And then it can go like down to, you probably hear about hemoglobin saturation because that is a symptom of COVID, is those levels dropping really fast. If it goes below 90, you can even be in trouble. But if it goes to like 80 or 70, or in some cases like 60, then that means really bad things, right? So hemoglobin saturation versus the partial pressure of oxygen. So as we increase the partial pressure of oxygen, we increase hemoglobin saturation in general. So at the lungs, where there's lots of oxygen, hemoglobin is going to pick up, right? It's going to pick up oxygen. At the tissues where there's low amounts of oxygen, it is going to release it. So these saturation curves are sometimes confusing to look at. So let's just look at under normal body temperature. So this should be on this axis. So that's partial pressure of oxygen. So we can see here that under normal body temperatures, we have this curve here. So that would be 38 degrees Celsius or like 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So that when my partial pressure is low, we're going to have lots of oxygen being released. So my saturation levels. So this would be like at my tissues, right? When my partial pressure is high, like in the lungs, right? My oxygen levels, my saturation of my hemoglobin is going to be greater than it is at the tissues. So this curve just shows how it is released, how oxygen is released under different levels of partial pressures. Now, other things that affect it, which one of the things that you'll see here is temperature. So we have an increase in temperature. This actually increases the dissociation. I can't spell that off, went off. So this dissociation. So at higher temperatures, oxygen is going to be released more quickly than at lower temperatures. So at higher temperatures, notice at higher temperatures, oops, here, at higher temperatures, let's get rid of that one. At higher temperatures, I'm going to have lower levels of oxygen, saturation of oxygen, because it gives it up more readily. The other thing that influences the dissociation of hemoglobin from oxygen is CO2. So when I increase the partial pressure of CO2, this also increases dissociation. So what affects whether or not hemoglobin binds to oxygen? The concentration of oxygen, the temperature, and also the concentration of carbon dioxide. So let's look at this diagram right here. So this actually shows the increase in carbon dioxide. So this again, at the same partial pressure of oxygen, there's a lower saturation, same partial pressure of oxygen. So this is PO2. Okay. How does this relate to pH? How does the level of CO2 relate to pH? So when we look at carbon dioxide in as a gas gets dissolved in water. So this chemical reaction actually occurs in two directions as well. So we have H2CO3, and then this occurs in two directions as well. So this is positive plus CO3 negative. Okay, so if we look at this chemical reaction, this is carbonic acid. It is a weak acid, so it disassociates a little bit. This is my hydrogen ions. That is what causes an acid. So this is an acid because it releases hydrogen ions. And this is my bicarbonate ion. Okay. So when we increase the partial pressures of CO2 in the blood, this is going to increase hydrogen ions in the blood. And this is going to decrease pH because you remember that those two things are opposite. So as the blood becomes more acidic, that actually decreases the pH. And so this is sometimes referred to as respiratory acidosis. So when you are not breathing properly, or if you're not able to get rid of CO2 readily enough, then your blood pH is going to decrease, and that could lead to death, right? So you have to maintain a relatively constant blood pH. And so if we look back at this diagram, that's why they are showing that with a higher level of CO2, the pH actually decreases. Normally, blood pH is about 7.4. With high levels of CO2, it decreases. And so this change in pH caused by the change in carbon dioxide influences the release of oxygen. So as we decrease pH, right, we increase dissociation. So at low pHs, hemoglobin is more likely to release oxygen into the body. So thinking about what is happening in a metabolically active tissue like your muscles, you're working your muscles, they're increasing their temperature. They're increasing the release of CO2. The pH is going to go down, and all of that is going to increase the probability that the hemoglobin is going to release the oxygen into the fluid that surrounds my muscle cells so that my muscle cells can take up that oxygen and use it to produce ATP. So that is the transport of oxygen in our body.